All right. Well, welcome everyone to this special event, Syria at the Crossroads, Popular Revolt, Counter-Revolution, and Regional Transformation. This event is co-hosted by the Middle East Research and Information Project, or MERIP, and SPECTRE, a Marxist Journal. I'm Jim Ryan. I'm the Executive Director of MERIP, and I'll be co-moderating today's event with Shireen Akram-Boshar, who is coming to us from SPECTRE's editorial committee. If you're unfamiliar with either of us, we're going to post some links in the chat to some of our recent work and ways you can support us going forward. We are both small, independent publications that really rely on support of all kinds from our readers. So we're really glad to have so many of you with us today, and we hope you can continue to stay with us, in our newsletters, in our publications, and at future events. To set the table for today's event, this collaboration between our two publications stems from discussions we've all been having since the fall of Bashar al-Assad's government in Syria last December. At both MERIP and SPECTRE, we felt that this was a moment that posed a set of difficult questions for the left and for everyone committed to solidarity with oppressed peoples everywhere, especially in Syria, Palestine, and the wider Middle East. In the immediate wake of the success of Hayat Tahrir al-Sham's lightning offensive last fall, and in the months since, these questions have really only grown and evolved with the situation. And some of these bigger questions that we've been sort of struggling with, internally, include, how are we to understand the trajectory of a popular revolution as it unfolds with a leadership whose roots are so clearly reactionary? What are revolutionary groups in Syria doing to press Hayat Tahrir al-Sham to hold true to the core commitments of the 2011 Syrian uprising? What are they doing to press HTS to bring justice to the victims of the Assad regime and ensure that the tools of repression under Assad are not simply reallocated to a new dictatorship? As Syria prepares for a period of reconstruction, what can be done to avoid the pitfalls of neoliberalism and market logics that fractured Syrian society in the first place? How are we to understand the dramatic realignment that seems to be occurring in Kurdish politics? Rojava, once at odds with the HTS, has now agreed to let its militias integrate with the Syrian army, while its putative imprisoned leader, Abdullah Öcalan, has called for full disarmament. Conversely, Syria's Alawite population has faced massacres and retribution lately. Are these excesses of a regime in transition, or a dark portent of retaliatory violence under the new regime? As a way of talking out these vexed issues, we really felt we needed to talk to people who have deep expertise in the region, people who have been there recently, can tell us a bit about what's happening on the ground. And we also, I want to stress, felt we needed to have multiple of these conversations. So we're hoping that this is the first of a series of conversations hosted by our two organizations over the next month or two that are going to bring in voices from across the region to help us understand what's going on and how to situate ourselves and what to pay attention to for folks that share our broad commitments. So I'm really glad to be here today with Shireen and the folks from SPECTRE, and especially with our three guest speakers today. We have with us Leila al-Shami, who is co-author of Burning Country, Syrians in Revolution and War, and a co-founder of the From the Periphery collective, and a member of the People's One. We have Wafa Mustafa, is a Syrian activist with the Syria Campaign and a former fellow at the Tahrir Institute for Middle East Politics. And we also have Djene Bajalan, who is an associate professor of history at Missouri State University, an editorial board member at the Kurdish Studies Journal, and a longtime writer and commenter on Kurdish politics in Turkey and Syria and writ large. I'm really, really glad to have all of you with us today for this conversation. I'm gonna pass the mic to Shireen in just a second, but just so folks know, we are recording this part of the conversation. We're going to talk between us for about an hour, and then we're going to turn the recording off and move to audience Q&A from there. You will be able to access the recording of this first hour of conversation on YouTube. We'll post links to that to our channel in the chat. And if you subscribe to our newsletter, you'll know as soon as it's posted. So with that, thank you all so much. I want to pass the mic to Shireen to kick us off here. Shireen?
Thanks, James. This is Shireen from Spectre Journal. I wanted to start with Leila and Wafa. Both of you have been on the ground in Syria since Assad's fall. Could you describe what the atmosphere has been like since Assad's fall, as you've seen it on the ground in Syria? What have people been feeling or expressing since December, and has that changed in the month since? So from your perception, how much of the Syrian population seems to be behind Ahmed al-Shara, and among workers and other segments of the population, does he have influence, or are there signs that he does not have their support? Maybe Leila and then Wafa?
Hi, nice to be here. Nice to see everyone. Yeah, I was in Syria last month. It was a very emotional trip being back there after so many years. And people are very relieved. People are very happy that the Assad regime's fallen. I think that's across the board. That's shared by all Syrians that have gone through 5 decades of such an oppressive dictatorship and 14 years of absolute horror since the revolution began. Of course, when you're talking about what comes next, people are not always completely on the same page. My impression is that Ahmed al-Shara enjoys a large popularity amongst the population still. And certainly that was the case in December. I think as time goes by, people are becoming more critical, and obviously it depends what sections of the population that you're speaking to. But I think within the majority Sunni Muslim population, he still has wide popularity. But obviously people are starting to get very concerned about certain issues. One of the issues that we'll talk about more in depth later is the issue of transitional justice, and not moving on that enough and holding regime figures to account. I think also among certain sections of the population, there's fear that power is being consolidated in HTS. People from Ahmed al-Shara's family have been moved into government positions, not major positions, but for example, his brother Maher, I think it is now Secretary General to the presidency. And some people are asking, is this a power grab by Ahmed al-Shara? And of course, and I'm sure we'll talk more in depth again later, amongst minority communities, there's a lot of concern, especially as the state and the army seems to be taking on very much a Sunni identity. And as I'm sure everyone's aware, there has been outbreaks of violence in communities with minorities. But yeah, those are just my first impressions, and I'm sure some of those issues we'll come on to later to talk about.
I don't know. It's very difficult to maybe summarize. I've been to Syria twice. Once, the first visit was immediately after the fall of the regime. And the second one was later in March. And I would say that the two were like very, very different. I was very different, but also people were like quite different. I have to say that when I first went to Syria on my first visit, I was not, I was mainly going to search for my father. So my father was forcibly disappeared by the Assad regime since July 2013. And of course, with everything that happened, with the prisons, being opened, and, me living in Germany for the past few years, I've done, everything I could to just go to Syria and, search for my father. at that point, of course, many of us still had hope that we could, maybe, I don't know, save our loved ones or find them alive or something. So I have to say that during my first visit, I was, I was half dead, like literally. It was my first time in Syria after 12 years, and of course, it was very difficult. I had, a roller coaster of emotions, but I wasn't really aware of, my surrounding, right? I was just, I spent 1 month and a half, and I was mainly just visiting detention centers, hospitals, morgues, and just going to protests. So I didn't really, even the people I, had the most encounters with were mainly families of the disappeared, people who I knew and people who I didn't know, people who I just met on protests or right at squares, waiting for their loved ones. And during my first visit, um, alongside other family members and former detainees, we met with the transitional president Ahmed Shara and the Minister of Foreign Affairs, Asad Shebani. That was early in February. And of course, the meeting came after a huge effort and a huge pressure from the families and from the media. And I also think from international institutions and from international powers regarding this, regarding the absence of any conversation about the issue of the disappeared or the truth or justice and accountability. So we met with them, and the meeting was was the first meeting, I have to say. But of course, that was the first time we were promised that there will be a commission. They called it a directorate at that meeting, a directorate that is concerned with the disappeared. And of course, that was, I think it was on the 1st of February, and we're now, May, and unfortunately, we still haven't heard much about this commission. But and I have to say, just in my first visit, that I felt very, very isolated in the sense that, and that's, of course, that's my own feeling, but, the fact that people were very, very happy, but there were also, the groups of families of detainees who were just going on the streets, losing their minds. I'm mainly talking about mothers, I've seen on the streets of Damascus, mainly, of course, going on the streets on daily basis, waiting and searching and fighting and crying and, putting pictures of their loved ones and their contact information on the walls and stuff like this. I felt a bit isolated, right? It was a very difficult moment. Everyone is very happy, and I'm deep inside very happy, but at the same time, it's the moment of truth, right? The truth that we thought we've waited for the past years. And unfortunately, I did not reach any information about my father beside the information that there is no information. And then, of course, like every other family in Syria, we're asked to accept this as the truth. The fact that there is no information is the information. And then we're just, right, like left alone again after all these years by the government, by the international institutions, and by many of the Syrian civil society groups to figure out how to search for information, what to do, how to deal with this, what they see as the truth, but we don't really see as the truth. And yeah, and then of course I came back to Germany, and then I visited Syria again. During my second visit, I was mentally in a different stage. I call it denial, but I've done, much more work with other people. I've talked to like different people, not only families of the disappeared. I've talked to youth groups. I've talked to, family members of my own community in my hometown, which is Masyaf, that is like in the countryside of Hama. And it's not, unfortunately, it's mainly includes minority. So it's, I was exposed to different perspectives. And I have to say that, as Leila said, in my first visit, I noticed that people were very optimistic, right? People didn't, I swear, like most of the people I met didn't really know who is Ahmed Shara, didn't know anything about his history, didn't really care And as Leila said, they just cared about the fact that there is a change. And, you know, I had many conversations with different people during my first visit, and I tried to explain to them that, you know, this is a group that we already know. This is a group that ruled Idlib for a while. We know, no. But people refused to like listen. People like were very, very keen to just, you know, hold on to this hope that everything will change. During my next visit, I noticed that also, in addition to what Leila said about everything related to the absence of justice and accountability and the power and and of course the violence, one thing that is very important is the continuous lack of services. At first, people thought that, you know, of course, big things like water and electricity and everything will change immediately. And when that didn't happen, people also felt a bit, you know, right? The anger is, unfortunately, you know, is being developed for different reasons. But even those who are like the most apolitical people in Syria, what they care about is their daily life, right? Their daily bread, their economic situation. And I think for that reason, you know, what we've seen, the atmosphere we've witnessed in the first 2-3 months is changing now, and people are even, I think I would say people are being more engaged politically, whether pro the government or against the government, but people are being, you know, motivated to be more engaged in different ways. And I'll stop here.
Oh, thank you both for that. I mean, it's a really powerful account, and I just want to say that, you know, to have you here as witnesses for what's happening is the first step towards understanding anything, right? And understanding, you know, answering the questions that we have. I want to turn to Djene because I want to ask you about a piece you recently wrote, you know, sort of about the politics of al-Shara and its role in neoliberalism. But I wanted also just to give you an opportunity to, you know, let us know. I mean, you've been in touch with folks who have been in Syria. You have a perspective on the Kurdish movement. I mean, what in the wake, you know, in addition to what we've heard from Leila and Wafa, you know, of al-Shara's victory, have you heard from or could tell us about the Kurdish movement and its role in what's happening so far?
Sure. I mean, first of all, I should say I don't have, you know, firsthand experience of, you know, how people are reacting in Syria. And, you know, whenever you're talking with people who are either in Syria or who are, a lot of people I know in Iraqi Kurdistan as well, who are Syrian Kurdish people, you know, that they will have a particular perspective. So I can't really speak to the facts on the ground on what the general sort of feeling is. But, you know, the impression I've been receiving is that, you know, people are, I mean, previously you kind of had an impasse between the SDF and the Assad regime, even though there were kind of periodical attempts to negotiate some kind of agreement or solution. But I think, you know, there's a kind of mixed feelings about things. Like, I don't think Kurds in Syria have much love for the Assad regime by any means, but there are still very concrete and serious problems. You know, just as, you know, the Assad regime fell, we saw these new military offensive launched by Turkey's proxies, the SNA, the fight over the Teshin Dam. You know, this is ongoing. The ejection of Kurdish forces from Manbij. So, and of course, the ongoing kind of a low rumbling war with Turkey, and, you know, the nature of this war, you know, these new drone wars we see, that obviously has a huge psychological effect on people. And those drone wars haven't continued because, you know, a drone war, you never know when you're going to get got. It's not like there's a front line that you can stay away from. You have this kind of permanent state of anxiety. Many of the people I've spoken to, you know, have spoken to that kind of fear. So I think there is perhaps some optimism that perhaps there are things going to improve in the future. I think the agreement between the central government and the SDF was seen kind of positively. But of course, events since then, what is this kind of agreement going to, how's it going to play out? How's it going to be executed? How can it be understood within the context of the ongoing sectarian violence taking place, especially directed against the Alawite community? There's a lot of questions that I think people have. So I think, again, I don't want to sort of speak on behalf of the Kurdish people of Syria, but I think there is a mix of, perhaps quiet optimism, but also apprehension about what this means. I think many Kurdish people see al-Shara as Turkey's guy. And, obviously that is going to play into the way that he is viewed by the Kurdish population as well. So, I think there's a kind of wait and see perhaps taking place at the moment, but there is still an enormous amount of tension, especially within, the context of the periodic escalations of violence, either by Turkish proxies. There was reports that a former SNA commander had been appointed to an important military position in the Kurdish regions, which was, very disheartening for many Kurds. So I think, that there's mixed feelings because, just as we see these things, we also see agreements regarding the Kurdish districts of Aleppo and sort of some kind of modus vivendi taking place. But everything seems temporary at the moment until there's some kind of permanent solution. I don't know how people are going to feel about this. Everything seems to be up in the air, I think, for the Kurdish people of Syria. And there are just factors that don't that are just not just purely linked to the internal affairs of Syria. How does the PKK peace process in Turkey play out? It's long been my contention that the Turkish invasion of Kurdish areas in Syria was as much to do with the internal politics of Turkey as it was to do with any realistic military threat that the SDF presented to Turkey as well. So I would if I was to guess, I would say I think there is a lot of apprehension about the future, but there's perhaps hope that the old impasse has been kind of overcome, and perhaps there is a possibility, even if it's seen as a narrow possibility, that some kind of equitable solution can be arrived at regarding the status of the Kurds and the Kurdish movement and the Kurdish political formations in Syria.
Yeah, I mean, thank you for that, Djene. I'm gonna turn to Shireen in a second, but I do want to come back to this this issue of Kurds in this political makeup. I think is an important point, and I think you're quite right to point out that it's not just domestic. It's not just contained within Syria. I mean, the internal politics in Turkey and in all of Syria's regional neighbors matters tremendously to what ends up happening in Syria, and in some ways hinges on what happens in Syria. So I think that's something that we're going to return to a little bit later in the conversation. I'm going to turn to Shireen now.
Yeah, and I think we are going to speak more about Turkey and Israel later. I know folks in the comments are eager to talk about Palestine, and we are definitely going to come back to that. But right now, I want to go back to Wafa a little bit about what you started speaking about. So to give more context, in December, as HTS and the other rebel groups were in the process of overthrowing the regime, they also went through Assad's prisons and freed detainees. So thousands of detainees were freed, but hundreds of thousands remain disappeared. The majority of them detained, obviously, or many detained by Assad through the course of the 2011 revolution, if not before. So HTS made a show of freeing the detainees in December, but al-Shara has since failed to adequately address the issue of the disappeared. So Wafa, could you speak about a little bit more about the efforts you've been a part of to bring attention to the issue of the disappeared, and what does this situation tell us about the post-Assad transition and about transitional justice more broadly?
I mean, it's not an easy question, because I mean, a lot has happened in the past 6 months. If you asked me this in January, I would have definitely had a different answer. Not totally, but partially, but everything is changing very, very quickly in Syria. and things are escalating very quickly. So, you know, like things that, you know, even for us as families of this appeared, you know, the priorities are changing for Syria as, you know, as a nation. And a lot of pressure is, you know, is being put on the families every single day. But I would say that everything that has happened in the past 6 months in Syria is definitely related to the lack of, you know, effectiveness and seriousness in dealing with justice and accountability in Syria. I would say that, you know, of course, after 12 years of being in exile, after 12 years of, you know, losing family members inside Syria, not being able to, you know, to be with your family, not being able to know whether your father is alive or not. Of course, I was, you know, at some point, I'm very, very happy to just be able to visit Syria. And I think this is the sentiment of many, many Syrians. People are really just genuinely trying to just enjoy for a minute the fact that Assad is gone. And to be honest, we didn't really have the chance to. And of course, the Israeli occupation, I would say, at least for me, is a very, very, you know, big reason to why we couldn't do that, whether because of the attacks that followed immediately the fall of the Assad regime, but also of course, the fact that the occupation is occupying more land on daily basis, the fact that, you know, Syrians in Quneitra are being just on daily basis humiliated and arrested and all of that. But you know, I want to say that the efforts for you know, for demanding the truth and demanding freedom has started years ago, right? And it was, I've always said, I have to say that it was mainly led by women. It was mainly led by mothers, sisters, wives, daughters of the disappeared. And of course, since the majority of detainees in Syria were men, of course, you had, you know, a majority of households of only women, not only trying to raise kids but what's very, you know, I've always said that one of the most difficult aspects of losing, you know, especially a man, a father or a husband, or for detention in Syria, is that you could not even stay in Syria. For millions of Syrians, we had to flee the country. And that the burden of, you know, fleeing the country, going literally with nothing to a new country and starting everything from scratch, fell again on women. And of course, you know, I was 23 when my father got arrested, and I was responsible for finding a way to flee the country illegally with my mom and my sister, who was 13 back then, and arrived to Turkey. And of course, you know, like literally with nothing, we only had our passports. So starting, you know, a life from scratch, and still at the same time, parallel, doing everything you can to just, you know, reach any information about the person who's disappeared. I would say that the families of detainees in Syria were inspired, of course, by, that's my opinion, where it's inspired by the fight of, you know, Palestinian mothers that, you know, for decades have been fighting against the Israeli occupation, the fight of the Egyptian mothers who've also been for years fighting against the enforced disappearance, by the Lebanese mother. So we're not in a vacuum. Of course, you know, everything I've learned about how to, I would say, like a big, you know, a big part of how I tried to deal with my father's disappearance was because of everything I learned from Palestine and from Egypt and from Lebanon and from Iraq. And I would say that, you know, the Syrian women, or the women of Syria, including Palestinian women as well, did a lot. I mean, with at least let's talk about exile, but like we've went from one place to another, from one meeting to another, from one protest to another. We've, you know, came up with every single creative way of reaching out to the audience, and whether it's the public or the policymakers. and raising awareness about the disappeared, making our demands very clear. We've addressed the UN, and I'm saying that with the grief. I'm not very happy. We've had to address the UN Security Council. We've had to address the UN General Assembly. We've had to go to all these assemblies and places and talk to policymakers who knew everything. But again and again, we were forced to re-traumatize ourselves every single day, talk to the media. I could never say no to a media interview, because every time I received an invitation, I thought, maybe this one will reach someone that can do something for my father. So I couldn't say no. And no one, of course, we're not even in a place to talk about how that affected and is still affecting the families of the disappeared. Families of detainees were the main reason to why the IIMP, the International Institution on Missing Persons, that is established by the UN, has been established. Families of the disappeared were day and night working for this institution to be established. And of course, the UN is the UN, but families were trying to deal with a very, very desperate, a very, very difficult, and a very, very complex situation. And they've tried in every possible way to find solutions, to find just small windows to reach any type of, truth or justice or accountability. The Assad regime collapsed, of course, and then suddenly prisons were open. Of course, I would say, at least for me, that was one of the most difficult stages of my life. I never thought that the fall of the Assad regime would be the worst, stage of my life. And that's not because I was not happy. Of course, that's everything I lived for. My father fought his whole life for this regime to be toppled, for freedom to be served for Syrians. But the way, unfortunately, prisons were opened, the way the international media dealt with prisons inside Syria, the way media, international and local, dealt with those who were released from prisons, the insensitive, unethical way we were addressed as families of detainees, the questions that were targeted to us, I kept, every interview I did, I was asked, why are you so angry? While I was sitting still in Germany, trying on Instagram and Telegram to identify my father's body among photos, low quality photos of dead bodies inside morgues or detention centers or mass graves. So, of course, many of the families who were in exile went to Syria, but it's important to say that the work families inside Syria have done in the past years was also very, very inspiring. Mothers who did not, manage to meet the UN Security Council member states were going every single day from one security branch to another, from one place to another, demanding everyday information about their loved ones. And if this is not advocacy, I don't know what advocacy is. The work they've done is very, very inspiring. And I would say that, our work in exile and their work inside Syria completed each other. The fact that, of course, I could not even imagine how, when I was in Syria, I met mothers who for years could not even tell their neighbors that their, loved ones, their sons or daughters are detained by the Assad regime. They had to tell them they traveled to Dubai to work, or they just died in the sea. So the smallest things that these mothers and these families, have done in the past years, all of it contributed to the Assad regime being toppled, I would say. And of course, people, after the fall of the regime, people took to the streets. You should just, I'm not sure if you've seen, but you should see photos from the Marja Square. In the first 2 months after the fall of the regime, the Marja Square was mainly occupied by mothers who came all the way from Raqqa and Deir ez-Zor, and all the way from Hasake and from Hama and from Halab and from everywhere. And, I talked to one of them and I asked her, where are you staying? She said, we rented a place in a very, very desperate, very, very bad neighborhood, 10 mothers in one room where they just sleep. They wake up at 7 in the morning, they go to the Marja Square and they stay there till midnight, and then they just go again, sleep and come back. And when I ask, what are you waiting for? They said that maybe because this square has been famous, you know, maybe when my son is out, he will come here so I can find him. And, you know, like these mothers, this work has definitely put a lot of pressure on the interim authorities, but also on the international community through the media coverage to understand that there is no way that we will all pretend that Assad has been toppled and everything will be fine now. And of course, these mothers in the Marja Square and the protests that were like carried by different people in different places in Syria and outside Syria were the reason to why the government felt pressured and felt that they had to meet us. And of course, this is not everything we want. And this is just, you know, meeting with al-Shara or meeting with the government is just the means, hopefully, to put more pressure on this government to understand that there is no way forward if you don't really effectively, seriously listen to the families of the disappeared, listen to the former detainees, center their experiences, center their dignity, and center their demands, and understand that without justice and accountability, Syria cannot, you know, move to a better phase. And I just want to conclude by saying that I strongly believe that the lack of, you know, the way the government has dealt with justice and accountability has definitely contributed to the massacres we've seen at the coast and to every single, you know, escalation and violence we've been seeing in the past few months.
Absolutely, yeah. A couple points that I wanted to highlight from what you brought up. I think many people don't understand or seem to have forgotten that millions of Syrians were not able to return while the Assad regime was in power because of the reality that it existed as a mass police state where you could be disappeared, imprisoned, tortured, disappeared, if you went back, just like the case of Mazen Hamad. And then you also mentioned, you reminded me that HTS, you know, took responsibility for the fall of the regime, but it was actually a culmination of over a decade of uprising, protest, efforts like the Mothers of the Disappeared that you mentioned. And then the last thing I would say is the continuity between HTS and the Assad regime. Unfortunately, there's been too much continuity instead of rupture. And that's the reality in the case of transitional justice or the lack thereof. So I think Leila wanted to add more about transitional justice.
Yeah, I just wanted to add, you know, this is such an emotive issue for all Syrians because there's very few Syrians that don't have a loved one who's disappeared. So for people to see that now, like 4 months on since the regime fell, there's been no progress on this issue is something that's increasingly making people very angry. And okay, we could say that, you know, setting up international tribunals and these things take time. But for example, the new government didn't secure the mass graves, for example, didn't secure the prisons. There were so many people going in, journalists, researchers, probably foreign intelligence, that were just destroying evidence. That should have been the priority, to secure those sites. Then also the lack of arrest of regime figures that people know are responsible for these violations. So, for example, one of the guys that was responsible for the Tadamon massacre, where many, many civilians were killed in the suburb of Damascus, the mass grave has been uncovered there. Fadi Saka was arrested, detained by the new authorities, and then shortly after he was released. And he was walking around Tadamon, where the families of the victims can see this man walking freely with the security forces of the new government. People were so angry. Hundreds of people went to the streets to protest and say, why isn't this guy behind bars? Not only that, but he's now been appointed as part of a new civil national dialogue initiative to carry out negotiations with Alawis on the coast and try to reduce sectarian tensions. And I think the point that Wafa made at the end was very, very important, that if there is no move on the transitional justice, people will start taking revenge and justice into their own hands. And unfortunately, in that, we're seeing that Alawi civilians who are not responsible are being implicated. So the new government should take a very clear line and say everyone who was responsible for violations, which of course includes people from HTS and from non-regime opposition groups as well, should be held accountable. And that also includes people responsible for these sectarian tensions, regardless of whether they're Sunni, Alawi, Druze, regardless of their sect background, should be held accountable if they're carrying out violations against civilians. That's the only way that people will have faith that's in the new government going forward, and that Syria can go into some kind of reconciliation process and move forward out of this conflict, which has drained us all over the past 14 years.
Yeah, thank you for that, Leila. I mean, all this reminds me that, transitional justice, if we know anything about it, is, at least on an institutional level, painfully slow in the best of circumstances. But in the absence of states that are willing or capable to do this the right way, so to speak, it relies on popular movements to generate that pressure, right? So what Wafa was saying and what you're saying, Leila, about the groups that have continuously organized since the beginning you've been laying the groundwork for 13, 14 years for transitional justice. It's there, it has to keep up, in a way, if there's any hope of a state coalescing around this particular issue. I think that's really, really important. And I also, really appreciated, Wafa, what you were saying about how there are examples of this across the region in Lebanon and Palestine and Jordan. I'd mentioned in Turkey as well. I mean, the Saturday Mothers have been protesting in Istanbul over disappeared Kurds for a decade plus now. I want to move us to at least one more topic before we kind of conclude the recorded part of the presentation today. I think it is important for us. I kind of have two questions here, but I'm going to skip one, Shireen, if that's okay, because I think we should address sort of regional politics here, and in particular, the roles of Israel and Turkey, who seem to be the regional powers now with the most interest in in what's going on, in the interest of I would say impeding on Syrian sovereignty in various ways, whether through occupation or attack or through all manner of schemes to fund and then hem in Syrian reconstruction. So I might start with Djene, but I would love everyone's response here about their understanding of Shah's place in the regional landscape and what that says about the kind of regime he's seeking to run. I mean, Djene called this very pithily neoliberalism with Salafi characteristics. I don't know how well that sits with everyone, but it's pithy nonetheless. And if you could also speak to either or of the impact of Israeli and Turkish sort of incursion, if you will, onto Syrian sovereignty in this moment. So Djene, I'll start with you, and then we could just go from there.
Yeah, I mean, I think as everybody is aware that al-Shara comes out of, a political tradition that shares its organizational and ideological DNA with groups like the Islamic State. But I think it's important to, think about how over time, the process of insurgency, war, and warfare have changed people's political orientation. And I think what we saw with the kind of split between HTS and the Islamic State is, to use a kind of, I'm using it facetiously, you have a split between, Islamic Trotskyism versus Islamic Stalinism, in the sense that ISIS, sought to dismantle the nation state, the Republican form of government, to break down the borders. People will probably remember when ISIS crossed into Iraq, they famously said they were putting an end to the Sykes-Picot political order. And in the type of government they formed, they adopted this kind of almost cosplay-like political forms, caliphate. The guy called himself Abu Bakr after the caliph. Al-Shara's, not that I think he's, abandoned his desire to Islamize and Sunniize Syria, but has adopted both the Republican form of government and has accepted the nation state as the sort of a legitimate political entity, and is sort of seeking to build Islamism in one country. And I think part of this is, he's made it known that he's willing to kind of come to some compromise with Israel, which reminds me very much of, the first coup d'etat in Syria in 1949, where, one of the objectives of that government was to kind of come to peace with Israel, but also trying to gain legitimacy in the international order by adopting a kind of neoliberalism as its as a kind of Islamic a technocratic Islamism, one which I think is very much inspired by Turkey, despite the fact that Turkey's Islamists and al-Shara have very different intellectual roots. I think they've kind of come to the same sort of place where they're looking for this foreign direct investment to kind of build up their country economically. Islamic movements throughout the 20th century have been extremely protean in terms of their approach to economic matters. People, if you look back to the Iranian Revolution, they sort of adopted a lot of sort of quote unquote left-wing populist economics. By the 90s and early 2000s, they were moving towards neoliberalism. Again, we saw this under the Assad regime, especially, liberalization sort of begins in the 70s and really picks up in the 90s, but it's not until Bashar al-Assad comes to power that there's this full embrace of neoliberalism. So one kind of continuity with the past is this embrace of privatization, cutting the state, encouraging foreign direct investment. And I think that is entirely compatible with the formation of a new authoritarian regime. Neoliberalism under Bashar al-Assad became a vehicle through which those connected to the regime could sort of monopolize the key economic sectors of the economy. It became a mechanism through which you could distribute largesse to favored communities. And one of the fears I have for the future of Syria is that what we're going to see is this kind of a reboot of neoliberalism. And that neoliberalism is going to, instead of benefiting people close to the Assad family, but benefiting those connected to HTS, benefiting, family members. So I think there will be, even if this is not the intention, even if the people in government at the moment, in their minds, in their hearts of heart, are like, no, we want to kind of build a new, open economic Syria, we want development, et cetera, the temptation that neoliberalism presents to political leaders to as a vehicle for the consolidation of political power, we've seen this in Turkey, for example, is going to be, I'm very skeptical that they're going to be able to sort of overcome the temptation, even if, at a rhetorical level, they're trying to build this kind of liberal, open economy. I think adopting neoliberal reforms could become a very powerful vehicle through which HTS can, reestablish a type of patrimonialist regime in Syria. So sort of on that ideological front, I think, there's a lot to be concerned about. I think there was a Facebook post that went around, where al-Shara's father was apparently, I don't know if it was true or not. I could never ascertain whether it was his father was an economist. I believe he was a Nasserite economist who was very concerned about the process of privatization and plundering of the sort of resources of the Syrian state. So, that's like one of sort of the kind of big concerns I would have in terms of the future economic direction of the country. And of course, because this will offer opportunities for international capital, I think, there'll be a good incentive for many of those states, most notably Turkey, but I'm sure states from the West as well, who will be more than willing to turn a blind eye to an authoritarian shift in Syria in return for, the contract to build a new port. Or, I mean, Turkish construction is salivating at the opportunities that the new Syria presents. And I think I would say, I would guess that the model that al-Shara looks to is the Turkish model. As I said, they come from very different political traditions, but the end of history comes for us all. And it seems that the end of history has come for al-Shara as well, and he's adopted this kind of technocratic mindset, not unique to Syria. I mean, people forget, but Ahmadinejad, was praised by the IMF for cutting subsidies and privatization that was taking place in Iran. So, I think we're heading to this kind of, as opposed to Ba'athist flavored neoliberalism, I think there's a big danger that we're going to have this quote unquote. I mean, the title of the article I was split between, neoliberalism with Salafi characteristics or the jihad for GDP, because, that's the kind of mentality, the technocratic mentality that comes forward. But of course, what is the political form that this will take place under is going to be a big question. And, as people have pointed out, we're already seeing signs of nepotism, favoritism, with it, and then perhaps that's inevitable. So I think that's a very big kind of red flag for me at the future, because after all, neoliberalism is not the only factor behind the Syrian civil war, but the degeneration of the kind of social contract that had existed since the Ba'athist takeover. You know, collapsed under Bashar al-Assad. Yeah, you had these very impressive, top line GDP growth rates, but this is happening at a time where, you're having land privatization, you're having people being forced off their farming land, you're having environmental degradation, you're having social services being cut, and in a sectarian regime, the first people to get the blunt end of neoliberalism are some of the most vulnerable in those societies. So, um, we could see after a generation the same cycle emerging again. Perhaps neoliberalism can, in the medium term, deliver some economic growth. I think neoliberalism for many developing countries has, at least for certain phases of their history, provided the basis for the emergence of a new middle class, et cetera, et cetera. But at some point, it runs out of steam, and you end up with a kind of crisis. We saw this under the Assad regime, and I worry we might all be here in 20 years' time discussing the kind of same issues.
Absolutely, yeah. I think that goes back to the issue of continuity and the likelihood that, or the reality that means that the causes of the 2011 revolution will stay unresolved, or a large cause of it. And that also, I mean, similarly, Ashara has been relating to other states in that, with that same mindset and ironically even inviting Russia in, etc. But I wanted to turn to the question of Israel, because on the one hand, we have Ashara, it seems like he's trying to appease the US to drop sanctions by saying, I'll normalize with Israel. At the same time, Israel has been bombing and taking more land than it did at any time during Assad's rule. And there are people protesting on a popular level in Syria. So I wanted to talk about that kind of, the difference in what Ashara is doing versus the Syrian population and those kind of dynamics, and what people are feeling on the ground about Palestine and the possibility of normalization. Leila or Wafa, do you want to take that on? Wafa, yeah.
Yeah.
No, I can just say something about I think, to be honest, I have to say, like, this is something that we've been reading a lot around the Syrian social media, which is that the social media is very different from the reality. And I would say that does not really, like, maybe that might not be very accurate when it comes to different things, but when it comes to the Israeli attacks and the Israeli occupation, it's really different because yes, on social media, I would say, at least, and again, I'm also speaking about, of course, my algorithm, what I see on social media. And then on the ground in Syria, I'm talking about the people I met, the people I talked to. And also one thing to note is that it hasn't been very easy to move around inside Syria since the fall of the regime, right? So, I've been to Damascus, I've been to Dar'a, and I've been to Hama, and I've been to my hometown Masyaf, but I haven't been to other places because it's been a bit challenging and difficult to just travel around. So, considering that, I have to say that every single person I talked to, when I was in Damascus and when I was in Syria in my last visit, which, since the 8th of March till the 16th of April, that was the period I was in Syria, there were Israeli attacks. And I was in Dar'a during the day before the Israeli attacks that killed 4 people on the anniversary of the Syrian Revolution, the 18th of March. And I've seen people, and I've attended the funeral of the martyrs in Dar'a killed by the Israeli attacks on that day. And I've seen the people, and I've talked to people, whether in Dar'a or in Damascus or even in my hometown. And by the way, my hometown was also one of the places that even before the fall of the regime has witnessed Israeli bombing. While somewhere like Masyaf that hasn't experienced the bombing of the Assad regime, of course, and of course, we all know and we have to acknowledge that, the people are very scared of the Israeli bombing. So their memories of bombing, their memories of violence are strongly about the Israeli occupation rather than, the Assad regime. Of course, my hometown witnessed a lot of shootings and arrests and killing under torture. But when it comes specifically to bombing, it has a different memory. But everyone I talked to in Syria, was very, very upset about the possibility that the government is willing to start a normalization process with the Israeli occupation. And, I would say it was very, very, very heartwarming and heartbreaking at the same time to be in Dar'a during the attack and taking part in the funeral and seeing how people were very, very, keen to make it very clear to the Israeli occupation, to the government, and also to all Syrians in other cities that we're not going to normalize the Israeli occupation. We're not going to accept that there will be bombing and arrests and killings, and that the government is going to normalize relationships with the occupation. And I would say, during my visit at least, and this is something we've been seeing a lot in the past few months, there are always protests inside Syria in all Syrian cities against the Israeli occupation. When Dar'a was attacked, all Syrian cities protested against that in solidarity with Dar'a. So whatever, but of course you also have on social media this group of people that just go around and say that, at the end of the day, what can the government do? Syria is very weak. The occupation has destroyed every single weapon we have. So we cannot really go into war with the occupation. So normalization might be the only way forward and stuff like this. But I have to say that on the ground, the sentiment is very different.
Leila?
Yeah, just to add to that, also when I was in Syria, the biggest worry that people had was Israel's actions and Israel's bombing and incursions into the south. And since December, Israel's killed like over 30 civilians. It's been kidnapping Syrians and taking them away, presumably to Israel. And, people are very, very worried. But I think people also have a recognition that the Syrian state is just, it's totally destroyed. It's just come out of its own genocide. Its air force has been completely destroyed by Israel. It's completely dependent on the West to remove sanctions and rebuild the country. And certainly Ahmed al-Shara hasn't even got control over all of the country, and certainly not in a position to go up against one of the world's biggest militaries backed by the entire Western powers. But what we have seen, as Wafa has said, is so much resistance on the ground from Syrians all over Syria. There's been mass protests against Israel, also chanting and showing their solidarity with Gaza, which has been ongoing since the beginning of the genocide in Gaza. We've seen constant solidarity on the ground from Syrians. And of course, there's been armed resistance against Israel, because in the south, people are mobilizing. They're fighting with the Israelis, and they're trying to push them back out of their lands, out of their territories, and defend their communities. So I don't think there's any will for normalization with Israel. I think if the government tried to make that policy, they would have no legitimacy at all amongst the Syrian population, and certainly not amongst Jolani's Salafi jihadist base that he comes from. That would be the end of him politically.
Yeah, thank you. I mean, this I think really encapsulates the crux of a lot of the questions that we've been struggling with from the beginning, right? You know, that you know, any popular revolt that would overthrow Bashar al-Assad would have to operate from a position of regional and geopolitical weakness, right? And we see this, you know, when we look at the leadership of all of the movements that have a stake in Syria. I mean, there are compromises that Shara is making. There are compromises that the SDF is making. There are compromises that many other groups are having to make because of this particular position of weakness. And I think it's maybe important for us to kind of take that into consideration when we're assessing what's going on and assessing, you know, the situation and how commitments are going to be followed through on. At the same time, the idea that these compromises reflect, you know, I think there's an assumption that these compromises might reflect something amongst the popular world that it couldn't be farther from the truth, namely solidarity with Palestine, right? You know, the idea that, you know, this is somehow a defeat for the Palestinian cause, or that has brought, you know, a pro-Israel leadership of some sort, you know, into Syria is profoundly mistaken for precisely that reason. We have left a lot on the table, and I hopefully we'll get some of this to some of it in the audience Q&A, which we're going to move to in a minute. But we are going to end the recorded part of this conversation now. And I think it just highlights how we need to keep having this conversation and bring more you know, voices into it. So I really do hope those of you who have been with us this far will stick around for just a few more minutes, about maybe 15 or 20 minutes more, to ask some audience questions, and then stick with us when we have the next event in this series, and keep reading both MERIP and SPECTRE and the awesome work that we're all doing there. So, you know, I'm going to say goodbye to YouTube now, but thanks for being here.